Hello and welcome to the programme. So another piece of evidence has surfaced pointing at signs of Russia's army involvement in the MH17 tragedy. A batch of documents has been published recently showing that more than 170 servicemen of Russia's air defence units were deployed near the border with Ukraine in Rostov region on the day when the MH17 jet was shot down with a Buk missile. That was back on July the 17th, 2014. Now, all 298 people on board were killed. To talk more about the ongoing investigation process, I'm pleased to say we're joined in the studio today by Mykola Kapitonenko, Director of the Centre for International Studies. So firstly, can you tell us a bit more about what this new information says and your views on how it could affect, if any effect, on the investigation?
In my view, there have been several news recently about the MH17 case, and all of them are not deteriorating significantly what the previous story. The most striking was the news told by the Prime Minister of Malaysia that there is not enough evidence that Russia is actually to blame for this.
I read this. Astounding, almost.
Yeah, that was something unexpected, but and something which brought about reaction from the mass media, from the authorities in the Netherlands and Australia, and I think this is important. But I don't think that it is able to change the story completely, because in my view, what has been done by joint investigation team is a rather comprehensive picture of what has happened back in July 2014. And the other thing, which is probably has more long-term consequences, is that this seems to be a part of a long-term strategy implied by Russia in order to make any decisions of international courts or investigation groups invalid or something which is not affecting Russia's position, Russian policy. It's something which cannot bring about responsibility by the Russians. Yeah, so this is not only about the MH17 case, but also about other cases where Russia has to be responsible under international law.
And of course, at the moment, there is the case going on in The Hague with Ukraine versus Russia. So this is a much broader thing and probably something that's going to carry on for 10, 15, 20 years, perhaps.
Absolutely. This is a broader picture. In what concerns MH17, it is the case which usually may take decades to bring to responsibility a state. But in what concerns a broader picture, Russia is certainly trying to get rid of any kind of responsibility under international law, to demonstrate that international law is not working because of the current political consequences, geopolitical play or anything else. So this is a part of a broader strategy for Russia aimed at avoiding any responsibility in different cases.
And what about this new information? Because we actually have a video of the original route that the JIA actually outlined, the route of the Buk missile when it sort of exited Ukraine and went back into Russia. But this new information seems to suggest that it actually went a different direction. So do you think that that could have any sort of effect?
I think we still have to get into details, and we'll have some time to see how it correlates with the previous version. But in any case, I think that the Russian responsibility has been proven by enough evidence so far.
Yeah, I think what really amazes me is how much open source data has been used to actually find out not just the route that the Buk missile took, but also who the perpetrators were, for example.
That was fascinating from the very beginning, that all the research which has been done by Bellingcat and other bodies, it has been done to a large extent on open sources and up to not only details of the routes, but also the people who were responsible, who were taking decisions or pushing the buttons.
Yeah. And even these documents that came out in Nova Gazeta recently, which they claim are the correct documents. They're not classified documents, they're just ordinary documents.
Absolutely.
So
we're living in a different world, I mean, internationally.
Yes, exactly. And there's so much information out there. But as you said, the real challenge is to take all this information and to make the state accountable.
Everybody may be sure that Russia is responsible, but the problem is how to make this responsibility political and legal. This is the problem.
Yeah, and I mean, from your experience, I would imagine that's a very complex process, sort of identifying the individuals who they were talking to at the time, who were their seniors, and that sort of thing, and working out who was responsible, really? Because you can't say the state is responsible. I mean, you can,
absolutely.
but then you don't prosecute anyone almost.
But you can come up to a certain level of decision making, and then you may actually claim responsibility of certain officials. And as far as I know, a very detailed work has been carried out since 2014, and it is bringing results.
Yes. I wanted to move on as well and talk about Ukraine's security policy, because now we have President Zelensky in power. So do you think that he's going to take any sort of different approach to security that we've seen during the sort of tenure of President Petro Poroshenko?
That's a good question, since nobody actually knows about the plans Zelensky has for foreign and security policy. And before the elections, we were considering that the most likely scenario is the continuation in more or less what has been done under President Poroshenko, with main emphasis on keeping deterring Russia in Donbass, striking for NATO and EU membership, and claiming that Crimea should be returned to Ukraine. So these were the pillars of Poroshenko's foreign policy, and so far it looks like, according to the visit Zelensky had to the Brussels, that his major lines of foreign policy would be the same, although there are also signals that the policy can change something slightly, some people think significantly, in what concerns managing the Donbas conflict. But in my view, there are considerable limitations, and the corridor of decisions is quite narrow.
Yes.
I mean that President Zelensky cannot just make a decision which is turning foreign policy and security policy to opposite direction.
So are you talking about sanctions, for example?
The same concerns the question of sanctions as well. So he will have to stick to the policy Ukraine had in previous 5 years. He will have to struggle for continuation of sanctions. He will have to put some emphasis on sanctions. So in general, he will continue the foreign policy of President Poroshenko, but some nuances are also possible.
Is this actually a problem of foreign policy? Is that if, for example, Russia expects that Ukraine will just continue its sanctions regime against Moscow, and the EU will do the same, and the US will do the same, that they can anticipate this and prepare for this?
I think Russians are doing pretty well under sanctions, and generally they have a quite high level of predictability of Ukrainian foreign and security policy.
Yeah.
That sets
Is that a
an
problem
ideal
in foreign policy in general?
That's good news for them, because they know what to do, what to expect from Ukraine, what to expect from Europeans, from the Americans, and they can plan a long-term foreign policy agenda. The problem is that the price Russians are paying for the conflict in Donbass, for holding Crimea, is getting higher and higher. And they are not only having conflict with Ukraine, they also have their global chessboard when they're playing against the United States, China, the European Union. And the weakening against these major actors is the major problem, long-term problem for Putin or for any other Russian president. And because of this, they certainly would like to have some form of settling in Donbass in order to ease the sanctions and in order to get more deep dialogue with other major powers.
But what does that mean, settling the Donbass? Because ultimately, Russia is paying a lot of money to maintain Crimea, and in certain parts maintain the militant forces that it controls in the occupied Donetsk and Luhansk. So they're not going to change this. But at the same time, if Ukraine gets more involved, then it's also going to cost Ukraine money too. So where is the balance here?
Donbass would require price from any state, either from Ukraine or from Russia. Ukraine will pay for restoring its territorial integrity, while Russia will pay for keeping Donbass under control, which is already happening. Russia is paying from $5 to $10 billion annually for holding Donbass. And the question is, who will get the bigger price? Who will have to pay more, or who will have to pay less? This is what negotiations are about. And also Russians are aiming at easing the sanctions, and this will make price for them less. So this is something they would want probably to make Donbass Ukrainian under some Russian conditions, under some degree of autonomy or veto in foreign policy, for example. And the question is what Ukrainians want. Do we want Donbass back under certain conditions? Because we will not have it without any conditions, unconditionally. We will have to pay some price. What kind of price it is, how much we are ready to pay. These are issues I think Zelensky should address as soon as possible.
Yeah, and he hasn't done that as of yet. And I would imagine certainly on the sort of national and international front that these are the most pressing issues about who he's going to appoint for these particular posts, probably the most important government posts in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we will have to wait the parliamentary elections, the results of the parliamentary elections, when the new government will be formed and the new foreign minister and defense minister will be appointed. And then probably it will be more clear about the strategy of Ukraine in what deals with Russia, or generally in what deals foreign and security policy.
Do you think that Zelensky is perhaps at a disadvantage now after he made statements on Snedanok earlier this week that he would be potentially up for holding a referendum on NATO membership for Ukraine, despite the fact it's in the constitution of Ukraine?
Yeah, recently there have been some mixed signals from him.
Well, exactly. I mean, what does that say, these mixed signals?
I think that this means that he has not still formulated his long-term strategy. He has not still understood what he's going to do, what the red lines are, and what his main emphasis would be on. So I think he's hesitating. He's trying to win the popularity among voters of different camps before the elections. Because of that, he is sending these signals to different target groups, saying that we are going to NATO because it is in the constitution. What he's done in the Brussels, and on the other hand, saying that we have to hold a referendum.
So he has multiple fishing rods out, and he's waiting for the fish to bite.
So far it looks like this, but after the elections he will have to make his mind.
Yeah, that's true. And also we had the trilateral contact group meeting, talking about a ceasefire, which they've done, I forgot how many times now that this has happened. But also they were talking about the economic blockade and perhaps easing restrictions. So in a way that also plays into Russia's, or could play into Russia's hands as well, because that's another way that perhaps they can not get round the sanctions, but sort of balance between the sanctions and the economy.
Yeah, and many people already have voiced that opinion. Just after yesterday, it was declared that Ukraine will probably ease or lift the blockade, and probably will introduce new ceasefire rules. And already today we have a sharp reaction from part of the society saying that this is what actually Russia wants. But this is a more complicated issue in my view, because what we're having in Donbass is a long-term, a very complicated, multidimensional problem. And if we perceive it as the battle between good and evil, between Russia and the West, for instance, then we will have this deadlock, which we are already having for 5 years. It is possible.
Well, that's an interesting point, actually. That is true. You have the good versus the bad, but and then there's a stalemate.
It is right. Yeah. We can have this frozen conflict for decades, like Moldova has with the Transnistria, so-called Transnistria Republic. They have this frozen conflict for more than 25 years. Ukraine may have the same, but the question is again: are we ready to pay the price? And aren't there any better alternatives to that? And what Zelensky is doing now is probably looking for those alternatives, trying to find out whether they are good or bad.
Do you think he has many alternatives?
He already has several alternatives on the table, and one of them is to try to look for a certain settlement. I mean, settling the conflict, meaning that the ceasefire is introduced effectively. That would require some conditions from Ukrainian and from the Russian side, and the question is what these conditions would be. You can always say that we are at war with Russia, to break diplomatic ties, to introduce the full blockade, and to change international position of Ukraine in accordance to this. This would be another alternative. The third alternative is the continuation of what we are having today, which we are calling the hybrid war. But this is not hybrid in the sense of classic strategy science. I mean that the combatants and non-combatants are blurred, and the different types of warfare are happening at the same time. But this is hybrid in the way that Ukraine is simultaneously trying to get into war with Russia, or saying that this is a war against Russia, and cooperate, trade, and continuing to do business as usual.
Yeah.
This is also an alternative. So there are several of them on the table, and the question is in picking one.
Okay, well, that's a great way to end the interview. Thank you so much. It's been great to have you in our studio today. Thank you. That was Mykola Kapitonenko, Director of the Center for International Studies NGO. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more here on UATV.